Welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Xuan Yo, and I'm one of the 2F Fellows this year. Our culture is deeply devoted to the idea that there are only two sexes. The very language we use seems to refuse other possibilities. This is illustrated as well by the way the medical profession treats infants born with ambiguous genitalia. When these infants are born, physicians often suggest drastic measures and surgeries to assign a specific gender to the child. The regimen usually involves the doctors deciding what sex the child ought to be. Then, the infants are surgically reconstructed to conform to the diagnosis. Body parts are taken out, others are added, hormones are given or taken away. In the end, the doctors have taken a body that was clearly neither male nor female and have turned it into one that they can present to the world as strictly male or female.
We are joined by Anne Snellgrove.
Hello, world and internet.
We've both spent a lot of time reading it in the last couple weeks.
Yep.
And I read it over the fall. I've also spent a lot of years trying to read the other stuff that kind of prepares you for reading Gender Trouble. I go by Dave Lisa. I prefer they, them pronouns. Speaking of gender, you will respect my identity. Let's just work through what are the main concepts in the first 50 to 60 pages of this text. What is the overarching goal of this project? Who are the theorists that she's using and who are the theorists that she's critiquing? What are the main ideas that she wants to leave behind? And what kinds of questions arise around, on the one hand, the terminology itself, just clarifying our terms, and on the other hand, what kinds of questions arise just related to our own lives, identity, desire, sexuality, etc.
Say that this is my first time being exposed to anything this difficult, and it was definitely a lot. I think I, for the most part, understood most of the ideas she was bringing up, but I think right now where I'm at is I'm having trouble just kind of connecting everything, and then her reference to a lot of other thinkers and all of that is kind of difficult for me to grasp just because I haven't been exposed to them previously to the same extent that you have and that you've been studying. So that's it.
It seems like there's probably more names in this text than there are words that you don't know, and there's probably more words in here that you don't know than words that you do know.
Yeah. And I know for sure in maybe 6 months or a year, I'm going to reread it, and I'm going to understand a lot more, and this discussion will for sure help, so
totally.
I'm excited to get into it.
But she forecasts in this text so much of what has become contemporary, both feminist and just gender debate, but also, this is intersectional through and through. The whole chapter 1, there's a couple of times that she really unpacks the complexities of contemporary feminism using intersectional analysis before it was even called that. And I don't know, I think it's really impressive. And let's dive into it. We'll start off with reading the 3 quotes from the beginning. 4 quotes. Wait. 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 quotes. She starts off with 5 quotes, and the 5 theorists that she starts off with are probably the theorists she spends the most time speaking to, with, and about in the first chapter. So it's very fitting. It's Simone de Beauvoir, Julia Kristeva, Luce Irigaray, Michel Foucault, Monique Wittig. So Beauvoir says, one is not born a woman, but rather becomes one. Julia Kristeva says, strictly speaking, women cannot be said to exist. Luce Irigaray, woman does not have a sex. Michel Foucault, the deployment of sexuality established this notion of sex. Monique Wittig, the category of sex is the political category that founds society as heterosexual. There's a lot going on just in those quotes. She's basically going to riff off of these. You can imagine that each one of these is like a string on a guitar and she's about to play us a song, right? And basically, she does want to challenge the very notion that there is a category of woman that we understand. That, on the one hand, she wants to challenge that we understand it, and on the other hand, she wants to argue that insofar as we do understand it, or feign to understand it, we also exclude and render unintelligible or incomprehensible other ways of being that don't fit within the rigid, dichotomous binarism between man, woman, masculine, feminine, that is itself based off of nature, culture. So the key concepts here, she's going to use Derridian deconstruction and Foucauldian biopolitics to look at the ways that power organizes the discourse within which arises or has been produced the concept of woman itself, and to say that what does it mean to be a feminist in a postmodern, she doesn't use that word, but totally she means it, like postmodern context, in a time when, this is why she actually says, like, perhaps it's time to come up with a post-feminism, because feminism itself often sort of assumes that it knows what counts as a feminine subject, and here you have these divisions between people who want to argue that it's based off of having a womb, contraception, and all of those kinds of biological concerns, versus people, basically the ways in which performance or expression of femininity are discriminated against within a misogynist society. Those are two different things, and a lot of times there are pretty well-rounded people who probably understand that both are important, but the contemporary debate between TERFs and the rest of feminism is one between people who are just like, no, trans people cannot be recognized as women because they don't have vulvas and wombs. And so that's actually something she's preempting here. This is before there was even a term for TERF. But for those tuning in for the first time on this whole kind of conversation, maybe people who understand feminism to really basically just mean that people are going to be treated equally or whatever. Well, TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. Really, it's just saying that it's feminists that exclude trans people from the category of woman, and usually from spaces that are designated for women. She wants to argue that the very category of woman, though, not just delineates or cuts out. Whenever you hear delineate in theory, just think of like cuts out with a cookie cutter, right? Because delineating really just means like when you're using out your fingers to kind of trace out like a pattern. You're like pointing out a pattern. But there's also this idea in this kind of philosophy where it's not just that you're pointing out a pattern, it's you're cutting out a pattern, and after the cut is made, you're not going to be able to see things the same way again, right? There's that classic Wittgensteinian example of the rabbit or the duck. You look at it one way, it's a duck. You look at it the other way, it's a rabbit. If you go into it thinking it's a duck, you're not going to be able to see it any other way than it being a duck. And it's really hard to see it as a rabbit. And once you do learn to see it as a rabbit, you can't see the rabbit and the duck at the same time. It's a good example of how a discourse can delineate some phenomenon of the world in a certain way that makes it comprehensible to us. Oh, it's a duck. But in so doing makes it incomprehensible as something else that it just as well is also. So, when you pick out someone of the world and say that they're feminine, then you automatically assume that they're woman as a result of that. It's really strange. It's also really strange to the fact that human biology is itself so much more messy and complex than a strict biological binarism seems to assume. People will just kind of make these appeals to the authority of common sense, when common sense itself is equipped with language and conceptual apparatuses that are not themselves natural. They did not grow on trees or descend from heaven. These are things that have arisen and been produced within social contexts. And if we learn anything in post-structural discourses, it's that a social context is not just a group of people, but that it's a field of power relations, and that those are complex, and their elaboration is something that has to be traced out. And we have to think about the way that language, as it functions within a social context, is used to reify, and explain what that means in a second. The same frameworks that continue to reproduce and repeat the same forms of oppression that already exist, right? So reify, we can use reify basically here just to mean to strengthen, to bolster, to sustain, to maintain. Using woman as the subject from which to fight for liberation reifies the binary that the oppressors have been benefiting from in the first place, which would be fine if it was an inclusive enough concept to really actually include everyone who is excluded from the masculine-centric discourse. But Butler says that that's been seriously problematized by the field of feminist studies, and that it's highly contested. And where she's going, we'll see that she kind of is like, yeah, no, it's possibly more damaging than it is useful as a term, as a point of, as a rallying point for any sort of liberatory front.
Okay, cool. I kind of just want to get into what you had prepared.
Where Butler's coming in on this, Kristeva, de Beauvoir, Wittig, Irigaray.
Yeah.
Those four are probably the ones that she is going to be engaging the most. She wants to take them to task for a variety of things. With Wittig and Irigaray, you have this idea that there is a feminine subject, a woman, the woman that exists before society, before discursivity, right? Discursivity has to do with discourse.
Yeah.
With not just like language and linguistics, but also the kinds of behavioral and thought patterns that organize, govern, and reproduce society as it is instituted. Butler, as well as all critical theorists and anybody who is a true philosopher and thinker since the Enlightenment, is concerned with the idea that there are unjust hierarchies that have arisen, that have displaced other valid and fulfilling forms of organization and pursuit and accomplishment and achievement. So hierarchies that we've grown used to, or at least that some people have grown used to, can be shown to be not just historically contingent, which is to say not necessary, but also seriously harmful, and insofar as they're unnecessary, we can change them, we can do otherwise, we can do better. Part of being a citizen of a society is trying to improve that society. That's what you do with your individuality. So, and some people find that super problematic, and they are neo-reactionaries. Let's dig into the theoretical aspects. So, she's going to take on Wittig and Irigaray. See, I'm looping back around. She's going to take on their idea that there is a feminine before the discursive, before the organization of society that is predominantly favoring men. Before a patriarchal society, there is a femininity that exists. In Wittig's case, she thinks that the masculine discourse has been kind of, it kind of props itself up by excluding the woman as the other and as a point of negation. You can use a little Gestalt theory to talk about this, right? Like the idea is like just with your eyesight or with the way we comprehend anything, whatever is on the foreground could not be seen without how it is in respect to the background, right? And how the background is can affect the way in which we see what's on the foreground. So this idea that the woman is the other as negation, that allows the man to kind of assume themselves and to comprehend themselves, means that the woman is kind of this unintelligible background upon which the man makes sense of himself. But it's not like done explicitly. It's done very much implicitly most of the time, especially if you read philosophy. Men who are writing in the modern era, like John Locke and Rousseau and all these folks, like they assume that they're able to speak for all mankind, and by mankind they mean woman too, right? Like,
Yeah.
they assume that they're able to speak for everybody, white, black, man, woman, doesn't matter. They can speak for them because as the given subject, they basically think that they're just like their way of seeing the world is the normal way of seeing the world, meaning that they have a sort of access, like a sort of immediate access to the way that people see. This stuff gets complicated a lot more later by theorists and philosophers, but just at the beginning, we'll take it. So woman's the negation upon which the man is able to assume themselves as the de facto subject that gets to speak for the universal, even though they are in all actuality from the standpoint of just a particular, right? There is this delusion of grandeur that comes from that positionality, that because it's a masculine ordered society, I have like this pretense that I am able to speak for everybody because I'm able to have this objective grounding. Bert's a good friend. He spent his whole life assuming that he's just like everyone else. Now, he thinks that he's unique. He's had his own personal experiences and struggles. But at the same time, he just sees himself as some guy. Whereas he still basically saw women and people of color and, like not cis or not hetero, saw them as, just deviations from the norm that he is. So basically he's able to assume not just that he is in the norm, but that the norm gives him like a sort of universal experience that only alters like in degree or its particularity. Other people who don't approximate, or they don't come as close to fitting into the norm, the cis hetero white norm as yourself, they're basically a statistical deviation from that norm. And but the more that they could understand that norm, the more they'd be able to understand the universal human perspective. Okay, but that universal human perspective in modernity is masculine, and that's what feminist and critical thinkers have been talking about. Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex. She was well known for being an existentialist and from being in the circle of people who were writing, which included her lifelong lover, Jean-Paul Sartre. And the two of them were couched in the projects of phenomenology and existentialism. When she wrote The Second Sex, part of it was like kind of taking to task this male-centric sort of assumption that was even in Sartre's work. She even saw it there. So I was saying that for Wittig, there's this idea that that woman, because of her sex, has the mark of the feminine gender. The mark of the feminine gender is an otherization that bolsters the self-same-centeredness, almost narcissism of the masculinist gaze perspective take on the world. So for Irigaray, on the other hand, it's actually even worse. For Irigaray, the phallogocentric discourse, which is just another way of saying what we've already been saying about this masculine-centric discourse, and then logocentric, meaning like logic, scientific-centric, but not like just science insofar as it's science, but specifically the kind of science that's been male-dominated. Yeah, gravity is objective, but like the questions that scientists ask and the ways that they term their questions and the categories that philosophers use to think and carve up the world are not just things that come down from an objective standpoint. They come from particular sets of interests within particular communities that have historically excluded particular types of involvement from people with particular sets of genitalia, or just like modes of expression itself. So
yeah,
that whole historically contingent evolution of a way of thinking and articulating the world and systematizing it using fields like in the sciences and logic and stuff like this is for Irigaray, it's this thing that has overwritten, overcoded, and completely rendered incapable the ability for women to speak, to comprehend themselves, to think or be. So for Irigaray, it's like there was like this, there was probably there was the pre-patriarchal society woman. She had other ways of speaking. She had other ways of thinking. She had other ways of comprehending herself. And it wasn't just like woman as like this unitary subject, like I'm speaking of it, but it was women as a polymorphic diversity or a multiplicity, which just means going in all directions. Lots of deviation is the norm, right? Where the idea that like woman is not just one, but like man is assumed to be one, the self same. Universal perspective on reality, but that's like an exclusion to like the other myriad ways of being and seeing that all get reduced down to other, which also not just being reduced to other, but also like robbed of the ability to speak for or see or understand themselves. So Irigaray, it's almost like, when a colonizer comes and says, we're going to colonize this, this region, all the tribes are going to have to learn our language and start practicing our culture, and you have to stop practicing your culture, and if you speak your language, we'll kill you. And, a few generations later, the language is completely gone. It's like lost, forgotten, the wealth of tradition and history and all of that's lost. So she basically is concerned that is exactly what has happened for women. Butler is concerned on a couple of fronts here. Two things. One, that in making the phallogocentric, patriarchal way of seeing and articulating things, this sort of universal oppressor, that a lot of the differences between cultures and subcultures are erased and reduced into like this same big umbrella, bad guy. At the same time, women are totalized. So it's like you can almost just say like, oh, well, women in any place on the planet, we can understand them because we've all been oppressed by men. Butler is like, this is the colonizing gesture, this is the globalizing reach of the Western colonizer. This is where we're coming along and speaking for other people's experiences and telling them what their mode of organization means. And while at the superficial level, it might just sound like that's saying that, oh, well, what is that, just like not politically correct, because we're trying to be post-colonial now. No, she's just genuinely concerned that kind of reductivism and that kind of like wide sweeping claim is something that oversimplifies the complexity of life, and that as theorists we're not going for the simplest theory, we're going for the theories that help us best understand ourselves and the complexity of the actual world and the people inside of it. So she thinks that that's the issue with Irigary's take. There's another issue. Nature, I think, is probably like the bigger other part, right?
Okay.
She's concerned that we make sense of the idea of woman as the opposite of man.
Yeah.
And that these are usually considered sexed and gendered terms. This division between sex and gender is one that is based off of the division developed by Claude Lévi-Strauss between nature and culture. And the division between nature and culture is one that people are, generally speaking, pretty familiar with. Most people know what that means. But when I started going to college, I admit I did not really have a firm grasp of it. But it's really just like, yeah, you have nature, just trees and grass and rocks and stones and animals and things like that, and that's the wild. And then there's culture, and that's kind of like the tamed, that's like the civilized version of things. But it's not just civilized. It's trained. It's contingent. It's we can change and deviate from the way that things are. So, okay, in nature, male or female or whatever other ways of being there are, because we honestly project those categories a lot of the time, and that has made some things more confusing because the way that sex plays out in different species is very different than the way that we project our simplistic categories onto them. The nature-culture division, though, is one that people are generally speaking okay with understanding. Like, nature is kind of how it has to be, whereas culture gets to be different. So in that, liberal thought experiment of like what the state of nature must be like, you have like this foundational fable, is what Butler calls it. It's a foundational fable. It's a fable used to justify the existence of the status quo as it currently is. Now, that's actually what she is concerned with, that is happening in a story about pre-discursive, pre-civilization femininity that has been colonized by the masculine, or the phallogocentric. In that narrative, Irigaray and Wittig are both giving into this sort of concept of woman that assumes the very category, the very framework, the framework that has the categories of man and woman, and that these categories themselves are wrought with problems and difficulties that aren't able to account for the complexity of actual human relations. And while we can generally accept that a man or a woman could express themselves in masculine or feminine ways, this idea that the man or the woman in question is the biological part and that the feminine or masculine is just the gendered expression part completely loses sight of the fact that we are assuming, without critical interrogation, we're assuming this prediscursive man-woman thing that just is what it is and has to be, given the facticity of nature, right? When in reality, she wants to argue, and this is like the great innovation of this text, she wants to argue that the categories man-woman, not just feminine but and masculine, but man-woman itself is a gendered, which is to say culturally constructed, a gendered projection onto nature. So we assume that nature is what it is and it has to fit within this binarism. But that is a projection of our gendered understanding, and that gendered understanding was produced out of the phallogocentric discourse that feminists are trying to subvert in the first place. So here we have feminists, some of the greatest ones ever, like Wittig, de Beauvoir, and Irigaray, all three using the tools of the masters, so to speak, in a way that, here they want to subvert that discourse, but at the same time, they're using it in a way that is destined to, instead of subverting that discourse, actually reify, maintain, sustain, bolster, and strengthen.
Okay, so we understand that, this is what she's saying. She's saying, no, these ideas of, Wittig and Irigaray, the way that we should be approaching, feminism, and aren't necessarily accurate, but I don't understand her reasoning as to why she thinks that.